We'll begin with you.
Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that yesterday was World Down Syndrome Day, and that many of the issues we're discussing today affect children and young people with Down syndrome. Also, I want to recognise the invaluable work carried out by the Ombudsman's Office in holding the State and HSE to account for their successive failures to provide services to people with disabilities. My questions today will be directed at the HSE representatives. Inclusion Ireland's recent survey on progressing disability services found that 85% of over 1,000 families have waited or continue to wait for more than a year. A survey from As I Am last year had similar results. Down Syndrome Ireland's recent survey found a disgraceful lack of services. For example, 64% of respondents in the Cork Kerry CHO4, their children received no therapy of any kind. A Dáil motion 2 weeks ago condemned the current situation for young people with disabilities as a gross and unjustifiable inequity in healthcare and education provision. The evidence is overwhelming. Progressing disability services is currently a failure. It's failing children and it's failing their families. It is breaching their rights and it is not providing therapies where they are most needed and most effective. There are several issues I want to raise. Firstly, Mr. Reid, in your opening statement, you claimed there are now 91 Children's Disability Network teams in place across the country. That is untrue. You have partial teams across the country. If Ireland started with 10 players last Saturday in the rugby, no one would say they had a team. Children with disabilities at least deserve the same standard. You do not have 91 teams. So when will fully staffed and resourced teams be in place? What date are you working towards to achieve that? The Human Resources Audit of Community Disability Network teams to identify gaps was completed by November. Yet today's opening statement, 4 months later, there was no update, no change in recruiting the required staff. Secondly, what is being done to resolve the massive inequalities based on geography? The Down Syndrome Ireland survey confirmed the worrying variations in services across Ireland. In CHO2, Galway Mayo Roscommon, 35% of children did not receive any kind of therapy in the past year, and this figure was almost twice as much for the Cork Kerry CHO4. In November, Professor McLaughlin, you decided to explain that progressing disability services is about replacing the previous system, whereby assessing services often depended on where people lived and how rich they were. The HSE has not improved that system. It's still a geographical lottery, and families that can afford it have to turn to private providers, and others just simply cannot get it at all. What is being done to address this? Are you committed to the establishment of full multidisciplinary teams in all regions? And as there may not be time to come back in afterwards, just one more thing I wanted to ask about is it was recently reported in the Examiner that parents of children with disabilities are being ordered to attend training courses so they can carry out therapies on their own children who remain on long waiting lists. And if they do not avail of these courses, their children will be taken off HSE lists for therapies. Are training courses for families being used as some sort of replacement for fully qualified therapists? And how many children have been removed from waiting lists by the HSE? Thank you, Gerlach.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Deputy. I'll make a few comments in summary fashion and then I'll just call on some members of my team to give some detail. Just first of all, Deputy, to recognise the waiting lists for children, and specifically the waiting lists in community care for children are far too excessive and a legacy issue that we are committed to addressing. Certainly in terms of how we will address it, we have secured from government and funding for National Service Plan this year significant funding for waiting lists overall, of which a significant proportion of that will be addressed towards community waiting lists and specifically towards children's waiting lists as well. We have a total of about 63,000 community waiting lists for children that we are anxious to address. Just make a couple of brief points. I do believe and that's an excessive list that we want to address all across the country. I would just like to recognise many children and our families do receive good care through the HSE and our services, and in saying that, fully acknowledging the stress that's caused by children who are on waiting lists and their families. Just on the recruitment, specifically to say to you, we are committed to recruiting into community disability networks. In 2019, There were 100 resources recruited into community disability networks. In 2020, 100, and 2021, 85. And our national service plan for 2022 facilitates us to recruit a further 190. So we are committed to recruiting into them and across the country. I did say in my opening statement, this is a real challenge in terms of getting health and social care professionals, but it's one we're committed to, and the funding is there for us to share. I might just ask my colleagues, Angela or Bernard, just to make some specific detail, particularly to the questions Deputy posed around particular CHOs and areas and receiving therapies and no therapies. So, Bernard, Angela, please.
Thanks, Paul. So I'll try and answer some of it, and Angela or Mark might pick up on some other bits that I'm not able to deal with. In terms of the geographical differences, we are very conscious of that, both in terms of the service experience for children and families, but also in terms of the staffing levels that are available in the CDNTs in the different CHOs. So in deploying the additional resources that are allocated to us this year, we have done it on the basis of analysis of the staffing levels within the teams, the ratio of children being supported, and also trying to take some cognizance of other factors in particular CHOs. So, for example, any indices that may help us in terms of determining need, levels of disability and so on, we're trying to factor that in. We'll become more sophisticated at doing that over the next number of years, but it was all part of the process this year. So we have weighted the allocation of posts to those CHOs and those network teams that are further behind in terms of the ratios of supports of staff to children, to try and raise the levels of staffing and consistency and try and address some of those geographical gaps. In terms of the training courses, and I know that there has been some experiences of this, and I do want to be clear on behalf of the HSE, there is not a position whereby training courses are used as an alternative, should be used as an alternative to appropriate therapies and interventions. There are circumstances where providing training to families and to parents should be complementary to the provision of direct services, not as an alternative to it. So where that's happening, or where families are experiencing a circumstance where they're being indicated that they're at risk, for example, of being taken off waiting list, that is not the HSE policy, and where it does happen, we will raise it with the CHOs or the service concerned to make sure that that doesn't happen. So to my knowledge, and I will come back and confirm this, no child has been removed from a waiting list because a parent didn't attend a training course. But I will come back to the committee and confirm that.
We will
just to
sorry, Sunil, go ahead.
Sorry. Just in terms of the training for parents, I think it's not a replacement for intervention. There are undoubtedly children who will require face-to-face interventions from the members of our team. But it does not, providing parent training is not offered as a way of making up for less availability of therapists. The reality for children with disabilities is that they live in their homes, in their communities, in their schools every day. And we need to support the people in their environments and their communities to facilitate them to communicate or to make the appropriate gains and changes so that they can maximise their learning and function as best they can in society. So it is a very valid way of working with families to help families to have the skills to help their children in those day-to-day environments. It's not a replacement for interventions, and some children will continue to require interventions. But equally, parent training is a valid and appropriate intervention to offer to families.
I will move on to Deputy Mayor O'Connor.